Eli Dawson was not the kind of man who usually found himself lost, but that morning in the wide open land of the West, he had wandered farther than he planned. He had been sent from the fort to deliver supplies to a nearby ranch, but one of the mules had broken free from the wagon harness and bolted into the dry brush. Eli tied the rest of the team to a tree and went off on foot, determined to catch the runaway before the sun climbed higher. The desert stretched endlessly around him, rolling hills of red earth, scattered mesquite trees, and tall grass bending in the breeze. The air was hot, but a cool wind carried the smell of water from somewhere nearby. Eli pressed forward, wiping sweat from his brow under his wide hat. His boots crunched over loose stones, and every step reminded him how far he was from the road. For an hour he searched with no sign of the mule. He was about to turn back when he heard the sound of splashing. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was the unmistakable sound of water. His throat was dry, and the thought of a spring hidden among the rocks gave him new strength. He pushed through the brush and followed the sound downhill until he came to a narrow canyon. At the bottom, between tall stones, lay a small pool fed by a thin stream. The water shimmered in the sun, clear and inviting. Eli smiled with relief, but as he took a step closer, he froze. At the edge of the pool was a young Apache woman. She stood with her dark hair falling like a curtain down her back, her feet in the water, her shoulders glistening as she lifted her arms to wash. The sight struck him like a bolt of lightning, not because he wished to see her, but because he knew he had intruded where he had no right to be. Eli's heart pounded. He stumbled back, muttering under his breath, "Lord, forgive me," and turned to leave, but his boot scraped a stone. The sound echoed in the canyon. The girl spun around, startled, her eyes wide and sharp as arrows. She gasped, then let out a cry that cut through the quiet. Eli lifted his hands high in the air as if surrendering. I'm sorry," he stammered, his face burning with shame. The Apache girl's eyes flashed with fear and anger. She darted to the shore, pulling a light cloth around herself. Her hands trembled, but her voice was strong as she shouted words in her own tongue. Eli could not understand them, but the meaning was clear. He was not welcome here. Eli backed up, his hand still raised. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know anyone was here. I was just looking for a mule that broke loose." Her chest rose and fell quickly. She clutched the cloth to her body and glared at him with such intensity that Eli felt smaller than he ever had before. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she hissed in broken English, her voice low but sharp. "You saw me. You must marry. Or they punish." Eli blinked. The words hit him like a blow. He thought he must have heard wrong. "What? No, I didn't mean to look. I swear it was an accident." But she shook her head fiercely. "No accident. You see me, it is law." Her words confused him, but the fear in her eyes was real. She was not speaking of her own pride. She was speaking of something much larger than herself, something tied to her people's traditions. Eli swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wanted to explain again, to beg her forgiveness, but before he could speak, he heard movement above them. Two older Apache men appeared at the rim of the canyon, drawn by her cry. They were strong, with long braids and stern faces. One carried a bow, the other a spear. When they saw Eli, their expressions hardened like stone. The girl pulled the cloth tighter around her and shouted up to them in her language. They answered quickly, their voices carrying down like the roll of thunder. Eli stepped back again, his pulse racing. He knew enough of the land to realize he was in danger, not just from the men, but from the law of their people he did not understand. "I didn't mean harm," he said aloud, his voice shaking. "I didn't touch her. I didn't know." The two men descended with quick steps, their eyes locked on him. The girl kept repeating words, pointing at Eli, then clutching the cloth close. Eli couldn't follow the language, but one phrase she had spoken in English still rang in his ears. "You must marry, or they punish." His stomach twisted. Could such a thing be true? Could an innocent mistake bind him to a fate he never expected? He wanted to argue, to shout that the world didn't work that way, but the fierce look in the men's eyes told him this was not his world. Here, it was their law, not his. The older man with the bow pointed at Eli's chest, then motioned toward the village in the distance beyond the canyon. It was clear what he meant. Eli was not free to walk away. He had seen what he should not see, and now he must answer for it. Eli felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He thought of his wagon left behind, the supplies waiting, the mule still missing. None of that mattered now. What mattered was this girl standing with fire in her eyes and the men who demanded he follow. The young woman spoke again, her voice steady though her hands shook. "If you leave, I am punished. If you stay, you must answer." Eli's throat tightened. He looked at her, at the fear hidden behind her bold stare. She was not his enemy. She was a victim of the same accident that had trapped him. In that instant, he felt more sorry for her than for himself. With a slow nod, he lowered his hands. "I'll come," he said softly, though he knew they might not understand his words. He let them lead him up the rocky path, away from the hidden spring and toward whatever judgment waited ahead. As they climbed, Eli glanced once more at the girl. Her eyes met his, still blazing but also filled with something else, something like sorrow. She had not chosen this either. And yet, by the law of her people, they were now tied together, whether they wanted it or not. Eli's heart pounded as they reached the top of the canyon. He knew that before the sun set, his life would no longer belong to him alone. Whatever awaited in the Apache village, he would have to face it, for her sake as well as his own. Eli walked between the two Apache men, his wrists not tied but his path clear. Their sharp eyes never left him as they guided him along the rocky trail that led toward the heart of the village. The young woman, Ayanna, followed close behind, wrapped tightly in her blanket, her steps quick and tense. The sun was sliding lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert hills. Eli's mind raced faster than his boots carried him. He had spent years working along the frontier, delivering supplies, fixing wagons, and trading with farmers and soldiers. He thought he had learned much about this land and the people who lived here before the forts and ranches came. But now he realized how little he truly knew. This was not a story he had heard from others at the fort. This was not a campfire tale. This was real, and it was happening to him. When they reached the village, the air seemed to tighten around him. The Apache home stood in a circle, built of wood and hides, with smoke drifting upward from small fires. Children playing near the edge of the clearing stopped suddenly when they saw him. Women looked up from grinding corn or weaving baskets, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Warriors stepped out of the shadows, their faces unreadable, their weapons resting lightly in their hands. Eli felt every gaze like a weight pressing on his shoulders. He wanted to speak, to explain, but his English words would not bridge the gap here. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, trying to show respect in silence. The two men led him toward a larger lodge near the center of the village. There, seated on a carved wooden chair, was the tribal chief. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined with years, but his presence was commanding. He raised one hand and the murmurs of the village quieted. The young woman stepped forward. She spoke in a rush, her words flowing like water from a fast stream. Eli could not understand, but he could see the fear and defiance in her eyes as she gestured toward him. The chief listened without interruption, nodding slowly, his face thoughtful. When she finished, silence hung in the air. Then the chief's gaze shifted to Eli. The old man spoke in Apache, his voice deep and steady. Eli caught nothing of it until the young woman turned toward him. In halting English, she translated as best she could. He asks, "If you saw me." Eli's throat tightened. He glanced at her, then at the eyes of the people fixed on him. His first instinct was to deny it, to protect himself. But he remembered the look in her eyes back at the spring. Fear for herself, not just anger at him. If he lied now, it might save him, but it would doom her. "Yes," Eli said quietly. "It was an accident. I didn't mean it, but yes." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. The chief raised his hand again, silencing them. His eyes remained on Eli, measuring him like a craftsman examining a tool to see if it was strong or weak. The chief spoke again, and Ayanna translated once more. "Our law says, if a man sees a girl in that way, he must marry, or both are shamed, punished." Eli's heart pounded. He wanted to shout that he was not part of their tribe, not bound by their laws, but the thought of Ayanna being punished for his mistake held him silent. He could not let that happen. "Tell him," Eli said carefully, "that I didn't mean disrespect. I didn't mean harm, but I don't want her punished for me." She repeated his words, and the chief studied him for a long time. Then he spoke again, slower this time, his voice like the roll of distant thunder. "He asks," Ayanna whispered, her voice trembling, "if you will take me as wife, if you will respect, if you will honor." The words cut deep into Eli. He thought of his life, long days on the trail, lonely nights under the stars, meals eaten in silence, the faces of strangers passing like shadows. He had never thought of marriage, not like this. He had no family nearby, no home except the fort. Yet here, in the eyes of these people, his choice would decide more than his own future. Eli looked at Ayanna. Her chin was lifted high, but her hands clutched her blanket tightly. She was proud, strong, but afraid too. Not afraid of him, but of what her people might do if he said no. Eli began, then stopped. He forced himself to breathe slowly. I don't want to lie. I don't know you. You don't know me. But I swear I would never dishonor you. If it's the only way to protect you, I'll do what I must. When Ayanna translated, another wave of murmurs passed through the people. Some nodded with approval, others frowned. A young warrior near the edge spat into the dirt, muttering something harsh, but the chief silenced him with a glance. The chief spoke again, his tone more measured. Ayanna translated softly, as if the words weighed heavy. He says, You have until the sun goes down to decide. If you choose no, then both are punished. If you choose yes, the law is kept. The crowd slowly dispersed, though eyes still lingered on Eli as he was led to a small hut at the edge of the village. He was not tied, but 2 guards stood outside, their presence a warning. Inside he sat alone, the silence pressing on him like a heavy blanket. Through the thin walls he could hear the low hum of village life, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices. His mind spun with questions. Could he truly marry this girl he had only seen for moments? Could he live among her people, follow their ways? What would become of him if he refused? After some time the door lifted and Ayanna stepped inside. She still held the blanket tightly around her, but her face was calmer now. She sat a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the ground. You don't have to, she said quietly, her English broken but clear. If you say no, they punish me too. But maybe, better than being forced. Eli's chest ached at the sound of her voice. She was giving him a choice, even though it meant suffering for her. That kind of strength humbled him. I don't want you punished for something that wasn't your fault, Eli said firmly. It was my mistake. If anyone should pay, it's me. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time there was a flicker of softness in them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. I wanted to leave, she whispered. To learn healing. To see outside. But law is heavy. Heavier than dream. Eli leaned forward slightly. Maybe dreams can be stronger than law. Maybe not today, but someday. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of the setting sun pressing closer. Outside, voices rose as the tribe prepared for the gathering at dusk. Inside, Eli felt the seconds slipping away like sand through an hourglass. His choice loomed over him, not only for himself but for the young woman who now sat across from him, caught in the same net of fate. As the sky turned gold outside, Eli knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened when the chief called him again, he could not walk away and let her suffer. Eli sat in the small hut long after Ayanna left, the last glow of sunlight slipping through the cracks in the walls. His thoughts spun like a wagon wheel caught in deep mud. Every choice he imagined seemed to lead into darker paths. If he refused the tribe's demand, both he and Ayanna would face punishment. If he accepted, he would be bound to a woman he had only just met in a life he did not understand. He leaned his elbows on his knees, rubbing his face with his hands, and whispered to himself, What am I supposed to do? Outside, the low hum of the village grew louder as dusk deepened. Fires flickered, drums beat softly, voices rose in chanting. Eli knew the time was coming when he would be called to stand before them again. His chest tightened at the thought. The door to the hut opened, and one of the guards stepped inside, motioning for him to rise. Eli's legs felt heavy as stones, but he forced himself to stand and followed. The cool evening air touched his face, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and roasted corn. The entire village seemed gathered in a circle around the great fire at the center. Men, women, and children sat or stood in silence, their faces painted with firelight. At the head of the circle sat the chief, his eyes glowing like embers beneath his thick brows. Ayanna stood nearby, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her posture straight and proud though her hands trembled at her sides. She did not look at Eli as he was brought forward. The chief raised his hand and the murmurs of the crowd faded. He spoke in Apache, his words deep and steady, rolling like distant thunder. Eli couldn't understand, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear. The chief was asking for his decision. Eli took a slow breath, his mouth dry. His heart pounded so hard he feared the whole village could hear it. He looked once at Ayanna. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, sharp and searching, as if daring him to speak the truth. "I don't know your ways," Eli began, his voice shaking. "I don't know your life. But I know this. If I walk away and she suffers, then I will never be able to live with myself." He paused, letting Ayanna translate his words into her language. Murmurs rose in the circle, some surprised, others doubtful. He waited until the sound quieted before speaking again. "I don't want to force her into anything, but if the only way to keep her safe is to follow your law, then I'll stand by her." When Ayanna finished translating, silence filled the air. The people stared, their faces unreadable. The chief leaned forward slightly, studying Eli with the sharpness of a hawk. Then the old man spoke, his words short and firm. Ayanna turned toward Eli, her expression unreadable as she gave the translation. He says, "Words are easy, but heart must be proved," he asks. "Will you honor me if I say you must live among us? Work as we work, share what we share. Will you take our life, not only our law?" Eli's mouth went dry. Living among them was more than he had expected. It meant leaving the fort, leaving his old work behind, becoming part of a world that had never wanted him. But as he looked at Ayanna, he saw the truth. This was not only about her honor, but about proving to her people that he would not treat their law as a joke. "Yes," he said firmly. "If that's what it takes, then yes." The crowd stirred again. Some looked impressed, others angry. One young warrior stepped forward, his eyes blazing, and shouted something in Apache. His hand gripped the handle of his knife. The chief raised his staff, silencing him with a sharp command. The warrior backed away, glaring at Eli with open hatred. The chief then stood, his tall frame commanding the circle. He spoke in a long, measured voice, and as he did, Ayanna translated for Eli in short phrases. He says, "Before the sun sets tomorrow, you must show your strength. You must hunt. You must provide food as a husband would. If you fail, you are not worthy. If you succeed, the law is satisfied." Eli's stomach clenched. Hunting in the wild desert was no small task, especially with no weapon but his knife and whatever they might give him. He had hunted deer and rabbits back home, but this land was different. Unforgiving, full of dangers he didn't know. Still, he nodded. "I'll do it." The people murmured again, their voices carrying both doubt and curiosity. The chief struck the ground with his staff, ending the gathering. Slowly, the villagers dispersed, leaving only the crackle of the great fire and the cool night wind. Eli was led back to the hut, but this time, Ayanna followed. When the guard stepped away, she slipped inside and sat down near the wall. The firelight from outside cast shadows across her face, making her look both older and more fragile at once. "You do not know our land," she said softly. "The hunt will not be easy. They test you to see if you are strong. Some hope you fail." Eli rubbed the back of his neck, sighing. "I figured as much, but I can't turn back now." Her dark eyes studied him carefully. "Why you do this?" "You could leave. They punish me, not you." "Because that wouldn't be right," Eli answered simply. "I don't know much about your laws, but I know what kind of man I want to be. And letting you suffer for something that wasn't your fault isn't the kind of man I want to be." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she gave the faintest hint of a smile. It was small, almost hidden, but it softened her face. "You are strange," she whispered. "Different from men here, maybe. Not all bad." Eli chuckled dryly. "I'll take that as a compliment." The next morning came quickly. Before the sun had fully risen, the chief's men brought him a bow, a few arrows, and a skin of water. They pointed toward the hills beyond the village, their faces stern. Ayanna stood nearby, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, watching with unreadable eyes. Eli slung the bow over his shoulder, took the water skin, and stepped toward the desert. The villagers watched him go, some whispering, others simply staring. He could feel their doubt following him like a shadow. As he left the clearing, he glanced back one last time. Ayanna stood at the edge, her eyes fixed on him. For a moment he thought he saw worry in her gaze, though she quickly turned away. Eli pressed on into the wild land, the weight of the tribe's challenge heavy on his shoulders. He had until sunset to return with proof of his strength. His future and hers depended on it. The desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving. He tightened his grip on the bow, squared his shoulders, and whispered under his breath, "All right, Dawson. Time to prove you're more than just a lost cowboy." And with that, he disappeared into the hills, the hunt, and his true test beginning. The desert was quiet except for the crunch of Eli's boots and the whisper of the wind over the rocks. He carried the bow in one hand and the skin of water over his shoulder. The sun was climbing higher, burning against his back, and every step reminded him how far he was from the safety of the fort. He scanned the land for signs of life, tracks in the dust, broken grass, the faintest movement among the shrubs. He had hunted before, but never under such pressure. This was no simple chase for food. His honor, his future, and Ayana's safety all depended on his success. The thought weighed on him more heavily than the heat. Hours passed with little sign of game. Eli crouched near a dry stream bed, pressing his hand to the dirt. He found the faint outline of hooves, maybe a deer or antelope, but the trail was old. He followed it anyway, moving slowly, trying to be quiet, though every stone his boot struck seemed to echo too loudly. By midday, his throat was parched, and sweat ran down his back. He sipped carefully from the water skin, knowing it had to last. He thought of the people back in the village waiting to see him fail. He thought of Ayana, her dark eyes filled with worry and fire, and the promise he had made to stand by her. That thought gave him strength to keep going. Finally, as the sun began to lean westward, he spotted movement in the distance. A small herd of deer grazed near a cluster of mesquite trees, their heads lifting now and then to watch for danger. Eli crouched low, heart racing. This was his chance. He nocked an arrow, raising the bow carefully. His hand shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. If he missed, the herd would scatter, and he might not get another chance before the sun set. He breathed slowly, steadying himself the way his father had once taught him when he was a boy back east, hunting rabbits in the fields. "Easy now," he whispered under his breath. He drew back, aimed at the nearest deer, and let the arrow fly. It cut through the air and struck true, landing just behind the shoulder. The deer leapt, stumbled, and fell. The rest of the herd scattered like smoke in the wind. Eli hurried forward, his chest tight with relief and sorrow all at once. He knelt beside the animal, placing a hand gently on its neck. "Thank you," he murmured, remembering something he had once heard, that the Apache gave respect to the animals they hunted, knowing they gave their lives so others could live. For the first time, he understood what that meant. He dressed the deer quickly, his hands steady, and slung the meat over his shoulders. It was heavy, but he bore the weight with pride. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with red and gold, he began the long walk back to the village. By the time Eli returned, the people were gathered around the central fire once more. Children's voices hushed, women paused in their work, and warriors turned their sharp eyes on him. The crowd parted as he stepped into the circle, the deer slung across his back. Murmurs rose, some surprised, others begrudgingly impressed. Ayana stood near the chief, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. When her eyes found Eli carrying the deer, something flickered across her face. Relief, perhaps, mixed with the faintest touch of admiration. She quickly masked it, but Eli saw it, and it steadied his heart. The chief rose slowly, his staff in hand. He spoke in a commanding voice, and Ayana translated for Eli. "You bring food. You show strength. You honor the law." Eli set the deer down before the fire, bowing his head slightly. "I only did what had to be done." The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Some nodded in approval while others frowned. The young warrior who had shouted the night before stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. He spoke harshly, his words like strikes of a drum. Ayana translated softly, her voice tense. He says, "You only got lucky. You are not one of us. You should not be allowed to take a woman of the people." Eli clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. He looked at the warrior and said firmly, "I didn't ask for this, but I won't let her suffer for me." The warrior snarled something else, but the chief raised his staff, silencing him once more. The old man's voice was steady as stone as he addressed the village. Ayana translated in careful words. He says, "The law is clear." The man proved his strength. He stood honest. The law demands union, but the heart must still choose. He asks, "Will the girl accept?" The crowd fell silent. All eyes turned to Ayana. She stood frozen, her dark eyes wide, her hands trembling where they clutched her blanket. The weight of tradition pressed heavily upon her, yet so did the pull of her own dreams. Eli's chest tightened. He didn't want her to feel forced. He had accepted the challenge for her sake, but the choice now rested in her hands. Slowly, Ayana lifted her chin. Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly in the silence. If the law says so, I will not refuse. But I want it known. I did not choose this. I only choose not to see him punished." Her words stirred the crowd. Some murmured approval of her honesty. Others frowned at her resistance. The chief listened, his face unreadable, then nodded once. He struck his staff against the ground. "The law is satisfied," Ayana translated, "but the spirit must grow. A union without respect is no union." He says, "You will spend a season here. If after that time both still stand together, then it is blessed. If not, the bond is broken without shame." Relief swept over Eli like cool water. A season? That was a chance, a test of truth rather than a cage. He nodded firmly. "I agree." The chief's words ended the gathering. Slowly the people dispersed, though their eyes lingered on Eli, some still full of doubt, others softened with curiosity. The young warrior spat again into the dirt before stalking away, but he said no more. Eli remained by the fire for a moment, watching the flames leap into the night sky. His muscles ached from the hunt, his body weary, but his heart felt strangely lighter. The worst was not over, but for now he had earned a place, however fragile, among them. Ayana came to stand beside him, her blanket brushing against his arm. She did not look at him, but her voice was quiet. "You spoke true. You hunted true, maybe. You are not as lost as I thought." Eli smiled faintly, though he kept his eyes on the fire. "Maybe I'm just stubborn." For the first time she let out a soft laugh. It was small, but it carried a warmth that cut through the night. They stood together in silence, watching the fire burn, both knowing that the season ahead would decide everything. The days that followed were unlike anything Eli had ever known. At first he felt like an outsider in every step. The Apache people moved with a rhythm he could not match, their lives tied closely to the land, the animals, and the seasons. But slowly, as the days stretched into weeks, he began to learn. The chief had spoken truth when he said Eli must share their life, not just their law. At dawn, Eli joined the men in tending to the horses, gathering firewood and hunting small game. He learned to track by reading the bend of a blade of grass or the faintest mark in the dirt. He learned to respect silence, for silence was not emptiness but a language of its own. The women of the tribe watched him carefully at first, some with suspicion, some with pity. But when he helped carry water from the stream or split wood without being asked, a few began to nod in quiet approval. The children were the first to soften toward him. They followed him around the camp, giggling when he stumbled over Apache words, laughing when he tried to balance baskets on his head as they did. Eli laughed with them, and for the first time in years his heart felt lighter. Ayana was never far, though she kept her distance in the beginning. She worked with the women, grinding corn, weaving, tending to the fires. Yet Eli noticed that she often glanced toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. At night, when the fires burned low, they sometimes sat near each other in the circle of light, saying little but sharing the same quiet. One evening, after a long day of gathering herbs with her mother, Ayana returned with a pouch filled with plants. She found Eli sitting by the fire, nursing a scrape on his arm from a fall. Without a word, she knelt beside him, opened the pouch, and began mixing the herbs into a paste. Eli watched her fingers move with skill, her face calm and focused. "You've done this before," he said softly. She nodded. "My mother is healer. She teaches me." She pressed the paste gently onto his scrape. Her touch was cool and careful, and for the first time, Eli saw not only the girl caught in a law she did not choose, but a woman with dreams, knowledge, and strength. "You'll make a fine healer," he said, his voice full of respect. For the first time, she looked at him without suspicion in her eyes. "Maybe, if I can leave." Eli hesitated, then asked, "Do you still want that? To go beyond here, to learn more?" Her eyes flickered with longing. "Yes, but dreams are not always allowed." Eli nodded slowly. "Sometimes they're not. But sometimes, if you fight for them, they become real." Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was understanding. Two people bound by accident beginning to see each other as more than fate's mistake. As the season passed, that understanding grew. They spoke more often, sometimes in broken English, sometimes with gestures, sometimes in shared silence. She told him about the stories of her people, of the spirits of the land and the lessons of the ancestors. He told her about his childhood back east, about the rivers and forests, about the loneliness that had followed him west. They discovered that though their worlds were different, their hearts carried the same hunger, for belonging, for purpose, for something more than survival. Not everyone in the tribe welcomed this change. The young warrior who had opposed Eli at the fire continued to glare whenever he passed. Once, when Eli stumbled in his Apache words, the warrior mocked him openly, and laughter rippled among some of the men. But Eli swallowed his pride and kept trying. Over time, even some of those who doubted began to see his persistence, his honesty, and his willingness to carry his share of the burden. The season moved on, the air turning cooler, the nights sharper. The day of judgment approached, the day the chief would ask if they would remain together or part. On the night before that day, Eli sat by the fire alone, staring into the flames. His mind was heavy with questions. Could he truly belong here? Could Ayanna ever see him as more than the man fate had forced upon her? A soft sound broke his thoughts. He turned and saw Ayanna approaching, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and shining in the firelight. She sat beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "Yes," Eli answered, his throat tight. She looked at the flames for a long time before speaking again. "When I first saw you, I thought you were trouble. I thought you would bring only shame. But you stayed, you worked, you respected. That is not nothing." Eli met her gaze, his voice low. "I never wanted to trap you. If tomorrow you say no, I'll walk away. I'll take whatever comes. But I want you to know, I respect you, more than anyone I've met." Her eyes softened, and for the first time she let a small, true smile spread across her face. "You are stubborn. But maybe that is good." The next morning the tribe gathered once more around the great fire. The chief stood tall, his staff in hand, his eyes sweeping over the people. Eli and Ayanna stood side by side before him, the weight of the season heavy on their shoulders. The chief spoke, his voice strong and steady. Ayanna translated quietly for Eli. "The season is done. The law is satisfied. Now the heart must choose. Do you remain bound or do you part?" The crowd fell silent, waiting. All eyes were on them. Eli swallowed hard, his chest tight. He looked at Ayanna. This was her choice as much as his. He would not speak before her. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "It is yours to decide." Ayanna lifted her chin, her dark eyes shining. Her voice was steady, carrying across the circle. "When this began, I did not choose. But now I see more. He has honored me, honored us. I choose to remain. Not because law says so, but because I say so." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some surprised, some pleased. The chief nodded, his expression solemn but satisfied. He turned to Eli, speaking again. Ayanna translated. "And you? Do you accept?" Eli's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, I accept. Not because I must, but because I want to." The chief raised his staff high, then struck it into the earth. His voice rang out, and though Eli could not understand the words, he felt their power. The crowd responded with a deep, united sound, a mix of respect and acknowledgement. For the first time, Eli felt not like an outsider forced into their circle, but like a man accepted, tentatively, carefully, but accepted nonetheless. As the people dispersed, Ayanna remained beside him. For a long moment, they simply stood together, watching the fire burn low. Then she whispered, "Now we begin. Not with law, with choice." Eli smiled softly, his heart full. He had come into this place as a stranger, bound by accident, but now he stood with her not as a prisoner of fate, but as a partner in a new beginning. Whatever the future held, they would face it together.